Hello, this is part of our continuing series of interviews with experts around the world about how governments are responding to the corona crisis. And I'm joined today by Don Moynihan, who's a professor at Georgetown University. Good to see you again, Don.
Hi, thanks for having me, Colin. It's good to see you.
If you could just explain what your position is at Georgetown, and then I'll introduce what we're going to talk about.
Yeah, so I have the title of McCourt Chair at the McCourt School of Public Policy at Georgetown University. And I'm also a visiting professor at the University of Oxford and Aarhus University in Denmark.
Okay, thank you. I was caught by something, an exchange that took place on Twitter, or less of an exchange, of you critiquing an article by Bret Stephens, an opinion columnist in the States. So maybe if we could just start off by you explaining what Stephens' argument was about.
Yeah, and for those who are not familiar, Bret Stephens is one of a handful of editorial columnists at the New York Times, and the New York Times is generally regarded as the most precious space you can find in the media to launch your opinion. So he has a very powerful position. And Stephens takes a more conservative approach to looking at the world. His argument in the column that caught my attention was that essentially the problem with the coronavirus response in the United States was a problem of big government. That the reality to fixing the problem was government needs to get out of the way, let local officials and nonprofits take the lead, and really just sort of remove itself from the process. And so I am a professor who studies government. It caught my eye partly because it just felt like something that was not just wrong, but wrong in a way that was actually incredibly revealing about not just Stephens' worldview, but a broader conservative worldview of government.
Okay, that's really interesting. And you started off by pointing out that actually it was some of the governments internationally with strong bureaucracies and strong governments which were doing best in terms of combating the virus.
Yeah, and I think a few months from now, when we're in some version of normalcy again, we can look back and do an evaluation across governments and say someone's doing better or someone's doing worse. But given the real-time data we have, there are obviously some governments that seem to be managing things better. I would say Taiwan, South Korea, New Zealand, Germany, Finland. And they're not examples of states with small governments, right? All of them have active governments. And that what seemed to me to be the combination that was working for them was they had capable bureaucracies, but also political leadership that was able to make use of that bureaucracy rather than one that felt antagonistic towards the public servants that were working for them.
Yeah, I think one of the points you went on to make was about this difference in the balance between political leadership and bureaucratic leadership in different states. And I don't, although people have a vague idea that the political leadership in federal government in America is much more extensive in terms of appointing agency heads and so on. I don't think people really understand it outside of the US very well. So maybe you could explain a little about that.
Yeah, and it's not an obvious thing. So I think most people just think of government as bureaucrats running things and maybe the president. But there are obviously very different styles of how to do things. The history of the US government is that we've relied extensively on political appointees. So in total, there's about 4,000 political appointees that help run just the federal government. In most countries that we would think of as peers, you might have the elected official who's cabinet secretary and a couple of advisors, but you don't have tens or hundreds of political appointees essentially running the organization. And so in the US, you have this thick layer of political appointees between the career civil service and the president. And so you have that in the US in a way that you don't have in many other places. And B, those political appointees just become a lot more important in times of crisis. So if you think about a sort of normal program that you want to implement, over time, bureaucracies are quite good at developing standard operating procedures. When they encounter these routine challenges, you can get something up and running, and then you don't really need a whole lot of political input about how the program should be run. But in something like the coronavirus, you're dealing with a different sort of challenge. It's a novel type of challenge. You don't really have the same sort of playbook that you might have had for other sorts of programs. You rely much more on the judgment of political leaders to guide you, and you depend on their ability to marshal resources in a way that's highly unusual. And so it's this sort of combination of two things that makes political leadership so much more important for the US and the coronavirus. There's a lot of political appointees who really do run public agencies, and their input becomes much more important in these non-routine situations.
But I think there's something interesting about the US at the moment in terms of that layer of appointees, in that the Obama administration, when it came into office, had problems, not as big as this, but they had big external issues to deal with. But the handover from Bush to Obama seems to have been much better handled. I've just been reading the Michael Lewis book on the fifth risk, which details a lot of the issues about the transition between the Obama government and the Trump government. And it's pretty clear there were some very unusual features to that transition.
Yeah, I think that reflects a sort of deeper ethos that people like Bret Stephens and others might hold, which is just a general suspicion of the bureaucracy. And with the Trump administration, that's curdled into something that's even more antagonistic. So when he uses the term like deep state, that suggests not just that he distrusts the career bureaucracy, but they're actually out to get them. And so the problems that Lewis talks about so well in his book is you have a group of people from the outgoing administration, some are political appointees, some are career officials, who are genuinely trying to help the Trump administration get set for the set of challenges that they're going to face. And the Trump administration's attitudes among many of the appointees is, we just can't trust these people. These are Obama holdovers. Whatever they're saying, we need to ignore or do the opposite. And that became especially problematic in the context of this particular challenge, where the Obama administration literally designed a pandemic playbook and said, if we have a pandemic, here are the list of decisions you need to face, here are the types of actions you should follow. And the Trump administration essentially just pushed that aside and said, this is part of the prior administration. This is not something we're going to keep up. They had an Office of Pandemic Preparedness under the Obama administration that Trump appointees decided was no longer necessary. So they folded that into another part of the administration and sort of devalued that as a function. So right at the start of the Trump administration, when there was efforts by the Obama administration to say, hey, you really need to take this seriously, partly because of that distrust, the Trump administration said, maybe we don't need to pay as much attention to this.
Yeah, one of the other points you picked up on in terms of the political differences, particularly with the Trump administration, was their attitude towards the private sector, which is the other side of the coin to their hostility to the federal bureaucracy. And you picked up particularly on the point about the whole ventilator issue. So I wonder if you could just say something about that.
Yeah, so I think part of the deeper conservative ethos about governing is that bureaucracies are monopolies. They tend not to do certain things well. If we partner with private actors, we can generate better outcomes. And on paper, that sounds right and accurate. And in many cases, it's true. But the problem is the government is often not very good at contracting for these services and gets taken advantage of by private actors, in particular, who might then end up, in the US context at least, donating a lot of money to the people who ultimately are providing funding for their contracts. So in the US case, the Obama administration had recognized there would be some benefit to having a stockpile of inexpensive mobile ventilators, had tried to contract for this back in 2011, 2012, had found a vendor, were moving forward. Then that company was purchased by another company who also produced ventilators, and basically the process stopped. The contract was never fulfilled. Thousands of these ventilators were not produced and provided some national stockpile. And so it's a simple example of where the sort of fate in public-private partnerships, while it might work in many situations, really did not work here. I think we're seeing other examples at the moment. When I read just last night about a company that seems to have some political connections that's getting a contract to produce face masks and has never produced them before in the past, and is being paid $55 million to do this at some inflated price per face mask. It suggests that in some cases, you're not necessarily tapping into the expertise of the private sector, more that you're getting taken advantage of by the private sector.
Yeah. And just finally, because we need to wrap this up, but are there particular pinch points in the federal administration where you think that the effects of the lack of political leadership are having a really dramatic effect?
I think there are three areas I would name. One is in the health area, the public health area, where I think it's clear that you had career public health officials raising concerns early on and identifying pandemic as a potential problem. And these get filtered through political appointees. And by the time they get to the president, these appointees are not pushing the urgency of the situation to the president. And when the president dismisses them, they're unwilling to push back. Okay, so I think that's one area. A second area is national intelligence and the area of defense, where we currently have a director of national intelligence who's essentially a Trump loyalist, has no experience in this, has been downplaying the nature of the pandemic. And so some of the warning signals that we would normally get from the intelligence community, which historically has been a strength of the US, you worry are being sort of switched off at the top of the organization. The third area is the State Department. I think with these sorts of global pandemics in the past, you would have expected the US to take a global leadership role, to be at the center of coordinating the global response. And it feels like the opposite at the moment. So there was, for example, one G7 meeting where allegedly they weren't able to issue a communique about the coronavirus because our Secretary of State insisted on calling it the Chinese virus, and the other countries would not sign on to that. And so in these different areas, I think we've hampered our own ability to be successful in dealing with the virus in the United States and more globally.
Okay, that's absolutely fascinating, Don. Thanks for joining us today. This will be going live on our YouTube channel within about half an hour or so. I'll send you a link as soon as we've done that. So thanks very much, and really good to talk to you again. Take care.
Thank you, Colin.
Thank you.